Firstly, I'll seek to take you into confidence on our, what I call the 4 concentric circles upon which South Africa's foreign policy are premised on, so that we better understand each other, because that is introducing who we are. Firstly, we are what we call a substantive Pan-African state. So our first foreign policy priority speak about the essence of Pan-Africanism, and part of my role in Croatia here is to ensure that we advance both South Africa's national interests, but obviously what I call the Pan-African agenda. And that Pan-African agenda, ladies and gentlemen, it's premised on the African Union's Agenda 2063, which speaks about inclusive prosperity for the African continent by 2063. It's obviously underpinned by 7 very idealistic ambitions, which speaks from an integrated African continent, integrated along the lines of culture, economy. It speaks about the centrality of peace and security, etc. And for us, that is key, ladies and gentlemen, because for students of both international studies and political studies, you would have some reference about the 1884 Berlin Conference, where European hierarchy decided to carve Africa into a number of pieces, obviously to ensure both colonialism gets to be advanced alongside the borders of imperialism. So there's a historical context, and I hope that everyone that does IR studies have a rudimentary appreciation about those difficulties. And those difficulties have not only divided the African as a cultural group, carved out along different states, but it also ideologically introduced different cleavages, different ideological thinking amongst African leaders because of the colonial role and what they've determined. And that's why we still had a number of difficulties with the issues about Pan-Africanism. To Pan-Africanism in Africa means the same for those that we call, that was colonized by the French, your Francophone states, vice versa, your Anglophone states, etc. So we have those type of difficulties, and if you look at it deeply, it also has a development complexity, because what the French did in terms of colonialism, vice versa, for example, your British Empire, it's quite different in terms of the legacy, what they have left behind. And that informs quite complex difficulties. For example, when one of the principles of the AU speaks about the centrality of democratic elected leadership in Africa. In fact, one of the aspirations of the AU speaks about deepening good governance and democracy on the African continent. So when you have unconstitutional changes of government, in particular in the Sahel, and some amongst us refer to it as a way of making sure the lasting vestiges of the Francophone are removed from Africa. It's obviously an antithesis of that values that the AU speaks about. So in as much as there could be some complications on how Francophone states have viewed itself, in particularly in terms of political economy with France, we are obviously, as South Africa, we hold very dear the decisions of the AU, and we do not regard, any government as legitimate that has come about because of the gun of the barrel. So unconstitutional changes of government, for example, in the Sahel, you had a number of the what it's called your sub-regional bodies. In our lexicon, we speak about it as your regional economic communities. And in this instance, ECOWAS, which have obviously a particular view that is reconcilable with the views of the AU. But then you have those individual states that says no, they are not obligated to advance generally what the principles enshrined in the AU agenda. And what complicates our Pan-African agenda is that those individual states are obviously then supported by both state and non-state actors outside of the African continent. Because of this one reason, and that is the reason of what we call political economy. It happened with the Sahel states. It also happens with Libya, for example, where you have the entirety of Eurasia that in one way or another are deeply involved in the difficulties in Libya. So that's obviously some of our background, but we as South Africa understands the central thrust and the need to ensure that there's peace and security on the African continent. So, for example, what we have done when we were the chair of the organ of SADC under President Ramaphosa, we ensured that for the very first time there's what we call a regional peace intervention by one of the multilateral regional organizations in the form of the SADC organ on peace, security, and cooperation. And that came about because of the Islamic insurgency in the north of Mozambique in Cabo Delgado. So for the very first time, out of your 16 SADC states, because of a number of reasons, 9 of those states could become what we call troop contributing countries. So we had a very successful intervention, and I must obviously commend also the European Union, because through the peace facility, it assisted to provide financial support to that intervention mission. But my brief, ladies and gentlemen, was also to take you into confidence on some, what we call some complex difficulties sometimes that the EU engage with. And one of the laws of dialectics speak about unity of opposites, isn't it so? It says sometimes for every positive there's a negative, and vice versa. So with support of the EU, the formal peace mission was obviously supported in as far as the regional intervention is concerned. But what the EU then did is to also engage in a different support mechanism by supporting also a bilateral intervention in terms of support to Mozambique for the fight against the Islamic insurgency. So, and that brings quite a difficulty, because the first step is that the EU's intention is noble. It's noble because it supports your sub-regional intervention, and then probably because of some other optics, it then also supports different bilateral interventions, which goes against what the regional body in Southern Africa sought to achieve. And that's why I've said that sometimes, because the brief was that I must speak about the positives and the difficulties, not negatives. So that's probably one key example that I wanted to speak with. And that's in as far as Pan-Africanism is concerned. The second method that I also want to highlight there, South Africa is Africa's most industrialized economy, but it's also Africa's biggest economy as we speak now. Because we have surpassed Nigeria. Nigeria used to be Africa's biggest economy, but we have surpassed Nigeria. So we are conscious of the fact that we are the biggest carbon emitter, because we are regarded by the World Bank as a high income developing country. Okay? So we are regarded by the World Bank as that. We then engage in terms of the Pan-African agenda with a number of our partners, including Europe, on the difficulties of how to resolve our carbon emission footprint. And we do that via a number of multilateral organizations, such as your Conference of the Parties, Azerbaijan, which escaped from that, the UAE, where we engage in just transition pathways, and El Sheikh in Egypt, where we spoke about the loss and damages fund. Simultaneously, a number of European countries also contribute towards ensuring that there's a financial symmetry available to ensure we decarbonize. And South Africa then has a number of sovereign programs, including that seeks to respond to our national determined contributions to make sure that our carbon footprint gets reduced. So we agreed on that at the multilateral level. Europe, number of countries also finances. So that's what we call your positive footstep, isn't it so? But once again, Carl, we then experience a difficulty. And this is important for scholars of IR and practitioners of IR to appreciate this. So whilst we engage in this very noble discussions with Europe, they then introduce a parallel policy perspective that seeks to be punitive in outlook, called your CBAM, the Cross-Border Carbon Tax Adjustment Mechanism, which says by 2026 they are going to then levy additional tax measures against countries who has not been able to reduce its carbon footprint in a particular fashion. Now that goes against what we agreed with Europe in multilateral structures. So I'm saying it's again one of the difficulties because it goes against the good faith that South Africa and a number of countries of the developing South are engaged with. And I'm raising it, and I hope there will be some comments, not questions, around trying to help us also to understand why Europe thinks in a manner in which it does. And then obviously, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest opportunity dividend economically at the moment is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which seeks to integrate Africa's economy. That is based on the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action. And I think if there is one thing that is different in Africa today than before the COVID-19 pandemic, is this treaty. It's significant because if you look at South Africa's export figures, in your free time you'll appreciate that because of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have been able to export as South Africa more to the rest of Africa than to Europe as a bloc. So that's significant. It's significant because before the implementation of this free trade agreement, Africa states, all 55 of them, and we speak about 55, I know Europe speaks about 54, because the EU don't regard Western Sahara as part of the African 55 states, but the African Union regard it. So we speak about 55, and that's why you'll always read about 54, because that is how you speak about Africa, but we speak about 55 African states because we regard the issues of Western Sahara as a key issue. As a key issue for everything else, but only 16% of trade currently happens amongst Africans. So our trade happens with everyone else than with ourselves. So you have increased logistical costs, transportation costs, cargo costs, etc. So we think this will be a game changer, and it's part of our discussions with the Secretary of State, where we have said that if anyone from Croatia wants to engage in economic diplomacy, you'll be able to invest in manufacturing industries in South Africa and then use that as a building block towards further industrialization elsewhere in Africa because of rules of origins, etc. So that is where we are. And look, the good news for young people is that the median age in Africa today is 19 years. So that's the good news. So you have this dividend. We don't have an aging population, we have a youthful population. Obviously, our dilemma is that the median age of African leaders is 63 years. So it doesn't speak cogently about the future. And remember, the future is not a distant future. We are speaking about the immediate future. But I think we are positive because you had a number of new leaders that has been elected, both in Mozambique and in Senegal, that are of youthful age or within a category of that we could regard them as not part of your aging population. Coming to the democratic dividend, I think all of you must have seen that, as opposed to what critics says about Africa, there has been a number of elections that have taken place quite peacefully. Just came from South Africa had elections, Namibia had elections, Mozambique had elections, notwithstanding some difficulties there. Lesotho had elections, Botswana had elections. So in the southern part of Africa, there's a real trajectory towards deepening democracy. And that obviously is a positive spin-off. The key issue, ladies and gentlemen, we'll still have to do is to look at, if you have that as a dividend, how do you then further deepen democracy? For example, with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had democratic elections. It was declared by SADC, the Elections Observer Mission, by the AU Commission as free and fair. But then the EU said that there's a range of observations that they've made, which says in terms of the EU standpoint, the Zimbabwean elections has not responded to international norms and standards. So once again, that is one of the difficulties, because you have the Zimbabwean parliament, you have the Independent Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe, you have the judiciary in Zimbabwe, same like in South Africa, that says this is a free and fair elections, but then your observer missions from the EU says it does not conform to democracy in terms of the optics of the European Union Commission. And I think it's an important area that I think we need to discuss, because, for example, the US just came from elections. What elections observers regards as what is the normative values or the framework for elections is different to what the American people decide, isn't it so? So I've raised that issue, and then obviously the second issue, in terms of our foreign policy pillar, is we are a champion of what we call global solidarity or human solidarity. We are a champion of that, given our own experience. I think every one of you know, even if you are European, that South Africa could not have freed itself just through the struggles of the South African people from apartheid, which was a hideous crime against the people of South Africa. For example, 1986, the predecessor of the European Union, European Economic Community ambassador, agreed formally to level sanctions against apartheid South Africa. So our human solidarity is informed by our strong, unique experience of having suffered from 1652 from colonialism, and from 1948 from apartheid. So we have that unique experience and understanding. So, when we speak about self-determination of the oppressed people, especially those located within the global south, we don't speak about only our unique experience, we also advance what is encapsulated in the UN Charter. So if you're a student of politics, or you're a practitioner of IR, look at the term self-determination. Look at the UN Charter of Values, it speaks about that. So when we say Western Sahara must be allowed to self-determine its future through a referendum where the people of the Sahari must determine whether they would want to be subjected to the authority of the Moroccan kingdom, or whether they would want to have their own future separate that of the Kingdom of Morocco. We speak about self-determination. So when we speak about the two-state solution in the matter between Palestine and Israel, it's not an issue that we speak about as South Africa. It's embedded within the Charter of the UN. Notwithstanding all your concomitant UNSC resolutions, etc. So when we speak about the fact that there's unilateral coercive sanctions economically through an embargo against the people of Cuba, we speak about self-determination because the Cuban people elect their own leaders. And if they want to elect their own leaders in accordance with a particular system, such is the same system that, for example, your Socialist Republic of Vietnam are engaged with currently. And the Socialist Republic of Vietnam is not again under any economic embargo because of that, them being a socialist republic, isn't it so? So you as the practitioners must understand that what we are arguing for South Africa is consistency on principle. It's consistency on principle as it relates to self-determination is concerned. And then obviously, ladies and gentlemen, you know, what brought me to Croatia is one of our pillars speak about an emphasis on cooperation between South Africa and, you know, the North. And when we look at your more industrialized economies, we obviously look at, you know, what needs to be done in terms of your SADC EU Economic Partnership Agreement. And I think your State Secretary was correct. We are the only country which have this strategic agreement with the EU. And we are only 1 out of 10 countries in the world that have that agreement with the EU. How do we transmit a same value system in relation to how Europe sees Africa to develop? What I really hope should not happen, Ambassador, is Croatia should never develop a Croatia-Africa strategy outside of the African Union blueprint 2063. We have seen it. The number of countries have developed what is called Africa strategy documents, but it doesn't speak necessarily to the blueprint of encapsulated in Agenda 2063. But then the question becomes, why do we need to have increased and enhanced engagement with Europe? Few examples that we want to make. Firstly, we are just coming from a pandemic, COVID-19, which you refer to as, you know, the pandemic obviously caused by the coronavirus, where you have seen a number of things. One, you have seen the value system which we came to have known from the side of Europe not to be the same in relation to stockpiling of vaccines, not allowing those vaccines to be shared with the poorer countries, etc. So that created a difficulty in our relationship with Europe. Secondly, you have seen economically with products from Africa and your own sanitary measures that you have put in place. So us obviously strengthening relations with the North, it's key to overcome you know, both the African difficulty, but to ensure Europe has an opportunity. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, is obviously global governance issues and transformation of global governance institutions. Now, I want to make a point that I think all of us should appreciate the fact that we are evolving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And our understanding, Carl, as South Africa is that multipolarity should imply the deepening of multilateralism. But it's not the understanding of everyone. You have seen it in UNGA, how UNGA for the very first time had to invoke very unique mechanism on peace. You have seen the difficulty in the UNSC when members of the P5 is conflicted and unable to provide leadership. You have seen the reluctance of many in the world to embrace one of the organs of the UN, which is your International Court of Justice, and your concomitant organizations such as your ICC, in terms of a number of rulings that they have made. You have seen the difficulty of your WTO in terms of vaccines production, etc., and the difficulties on the World Health Organizations, the funding of the World Health Organizations, etc. So those, ladies and gentlemen, broadly speaking, encapsulate what is South Africa's value proposition, not only to Croatia but to the rest of the world. Let me stop and listen at this time to important comments and clarifications from your side. Thank you.